website. Additionally, you can ask a question using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to everyone's questions, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our customers and new friends for keeping our business and our spirits afloat, and for the authors for giving us their time to talk about books with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. TJ Newman is a former bookseller and Virgin Atlantic flight attendant. It was on these flights where she wrote much of her debut novel, Falling. It was named one of the most anticipated books of the summer by dozens of news outlets, including USA Today, Newsweek, Entertainment Weekly, and The Hollywood Reporter. Gillian Flynn calls it a must-read, and Don Winslow says it's stunning and relentless. This is Jaws at 35,000 feet. I've read it myself. It is fantastic. Has a bookseller stamp of approval from not just me, but everywhere. So please help me in welcoming TJ Newman to Politics and Prose Live. Welcome.
Hi, Jess. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much to Politics and Prose for having me here. This is really wonderful to be with you all, wherever you all are. So, hi. Falling. That's my book. That's what you're here to hear about. So, in case you're brand new to it and don't know what it's about, I'll give you the elevator pitch, if you will. Falling tells the story of Coastal Airways Flight 416, a flight from Los Angeles to New York. And what the passengers on board this flight don't know is that just before they took off, the family of their pilot was kidnapped. And he has now been told that he can either crash the plane or his family will die. So the book then follows the valiant efforts of the crew and the passengers in the air and the FBI and the family on the ground in their attempts to do the impossible. Just thought it would be good if I read something from it. So I'm going to go ahead and read the prologue because quite frankly, I can't read that much from the rest of the book without it just being spoiler after spoiler. So I'm going to read from the prologue, and bear with me. This is actually the first time that I've ever read it out loud to anyone. So yeah, here we go. Okay. When the shoe dropped into her lap, the foot was still in it. She flung it into the air with a shriek. The bloodied mass hung in weightless suspension before being sucked out of the massive hole in the side of the aircraft. On the floor next to her seat, a flight attendant crawled up the aisle screaming for the passengers to put their oxygen masks on. From the back of the airplane, Bill observed it all. The passenger with the shoe clearly couldn't hear what the young flight attendant was yelling. She probably hadn't heard a thing since the explosion. Thin lines of blood trickled out of both ears. The blast had thrown the flight attendant's body into the air and then back down, her head of curly brown hair hitting the floor with a thwack. She lay motionless for a second before the plane went into a steep nosedive. Sliding down the aisle, the flight attendant grabbed at the metal rungs beneath the passenger seats. Clutching onto one, her arms shook as she tried to pull herself up against the plane's downward pitch. As she flipped onto her side, her feet floated and dangled in the air. Debris flew all around the plane, paper and clothing, a laptop, a soda can, a baby's blanket. It was like the inside of a tornado. Bill followed her gaze down the plane and saw sky. Sunlight shone in on them from a wide opening that had been the overwing emergency exit not 30 seconds ago. The other flight attendant had just stopped there to collect trash. Bill had watched the older, red-headed flight attendant smile, take the empty cup in her gloved hand, drop it in the plastic bag, and then in one explosive moment, she was gone. The whole row was gone. The side of the aircraft was gone. Bill widened his stance as the plane yawed left to right, seemingly unable to keep a straight path. Of course, the rudder, he thought. The whole tail was probably damaged. A crack came from above the brunette flight attendant's head as several overhead bins burst open. Luggage tumbled out, tossed violently about the cabin. A large pink suitcase with wheels shot forward, sucked towards the opening. It hit the side of the fuselage as it went out, a chunk of the aircraft's skin ripping off with it. Exposed frames and stringers created a lattice of human engineering against the heavens. Beyond the whipping wires, hissing orange and yellow sparks, clouds dotted the view. Bill squinted against the sun. The plane leveled off enough that the flight attendant on the floor could get to her knees. Bill watched her struggle against a body that wouldn't cooperate. She managed to pull her leg forward, only to find her femur sticking out of her thigh. She blinked at the bloody wound a few times, and then kept crawling. "Masks!" she screamed, dragging herself up the aisle toward the back of the plane, her voice barely audible above the deafening roar of wind. She looked over to a man grabbing at the oxygen mask. He caught one and went to put it over his face, but a gust ripped it out of his fingers, plastic and elastic straps flailing. Gray fog choked the cabin in a swirling haze of debris and chaos. A metal water bottle went flying through the air, smacking into the crawling flight attendant's face. Blood began to pour from her nose. "He's been shot! My husband! Help!" Bill looked to the woman, pounding her fists against her husband's lifeless torso. 2 small circles in his forehead streamed red over his eyes and down his cheeks. The flight attendant brushed the curls out of her face as she pulled herself up on the armrest for a closer look. They weren't bullets. They were rivets from the plane. The plane vibrated violently and the floor began to buckle. Bill could feel everything shifting beneath him. He wondered if the airframe would hold. He wondered how much time they had. The flight attendant continued on, placing her hand in a dark spot on the carpet. At the same moment, Bill smelled the urine. The flight attendant looked up at the man in the aisle seat. He stared off in a state of shock, the puddle spreading at his feet. "Ice!" someone moaned. The flight attendant turned. Bill watched the passenger on the other side of the aisle extend her hands to the young woman, holding out a fleshy chunk of something. The flight attendant recoiled. Looking up, the passenger's chin and neck were painted crimson. "Ice!" she repeated, a wave of blood gushing out of her mouth. It was her tongue. Bill glanced over his shoulder to the back wall, watching the cord of the interphone thrash in the wind as the flight attendant crawled towards it. He looked to the other side of the galley. The third flight attendant lay crumpled on the floor, a toppled carton of juice next to her. Bill turned his head to the side, watching the glugs of orange mixed with the pool of red around her body. The brunette dragged herself at last to the end of the aisle, packets of sugar and mini creamers crunching against her uniform. She reached a hand forward, but yanked it back. A pair of black dress shoes blocked her path. The flight attendant looked up. Lying at Bill's feet, broken and bloodied, her jaw hung open, but no words came. Bill's tie flapped in the wind. The sound of the engine screamed at them both, willing something, anything, to happen. "But if you're," the flight attendant stammered, looking up at Bill, betrayal written across her face. "Who has control of the plane, Captain Hoffman?" Bill inhaled sharply as though to speak, but couldn't. He looked down the plane to the closed cockpit door. He was supposed to be on the other side. Bill leapt over the flight attendant, sprinting down the aisle toward the front of the aircraft. He ran as fast as he could, but the door seemed to move farther away the faster he ran. All around him, people cried out, begging him to stop and help them. He kept running. The door kept moving farther and farther away. He closed his eyes. His body slammed into the door without warning, his skull bashing against the impenetrable surface. His hands cradled his head as he stumbled backwards. Woozy, he tried to think of how he could breach the sealed cockpit, but not a single idea came to mind. He pounded on the door until his fists went numb, and hyperventilating, he stepped back to kick at it when he heard a click. The door unlocked and cracked open. Bill rushed inside. Buttons flashed red and amber warnings on nearly every surface in the cockpit. A loud, incessant alarm screeched, the shrill noise intensifying in the tiny space. He sat down in the seat on his left, the captain's seat. He struggled to focus on the display in front of him as the plane's thrashing tossed the numbers about. Red followed him everywhere he looked. Every button, every knob, every display was screaming at him. Through the window, the approaching ground loomed closer and closer. "Get to work," Bill ordered himself. His hands stretched out in front of him, frozen. "Damn it, you're the captain. You need to make a decision. You're running out of time." The alarms got louder. A robotic voice repeatedly commanded him to pull up. What about asymmetrical thrust? Bill turned his head. From the co-pilot seat, his 10-year-old son, Scott, shrugged. He was wearing his solar system pajamas. His feet didn't touch the ground. You could give that a try, the boy added. Bill looked back to his hands. His fingers refused to move. They just hung in the air. Fine then, do it the hard way. Dive and use speed to keep a straight line. He turned again to see his wife now reclined in the chair, arms crossed. She gave him that smirk, the one she used when they both knew she was right. God, she was gorgeous. Sweat dripped down his neck as he struggled to move and take action. But he remained paralyzed in fear, terrified he would make the wrong call. Carrie tucked her hair behind one ear as she leaned over, placing a hand on her husband's knee. Bill, it's time. He gasped for air as his body shot upright. Moonlight poured through the crack in the curtains to streak across the king-size bed. He scanned the room for the flashing warnings. He listened for the alarms, but heard only a neighbor's dog barking outside. Bill dropped his head in his hands with an exhale. Same one? Carrie asked from the other side of the bed. He nodded in the dark. So that is the prologue of Falling. Yeah, thank you for listening to that. That was kind of fun, quite frankly. I've actually never read that before like that. So a little bit about the backstory of Falling and also of me and how I got to this point is that I'm a flight attendant. I was a flight attendant, I should say. I have since quit my job once I got a book contract. But I was a flight attendant for 10 years. And it was at work that I had the idea for this book. And before I was a flight attendant, as Jess said, I was a bookseller. And before I was a bookseller, I was a struggling actor in New York, trying to make it on Broadway. Which clearly didn't work out very well since I'm not talking to you about a Broadway show I'm in. That was my first round of abject failure over and over and over and over again. So I moved to New York after college. I tried that, didn't work. And so I left New York and I moved back home, back in with my parents. And which is fun to be a mid-20 something back at home, not knowing what you're going to do with your life, living with your parents again. And that's when I got a job at Changing Hands Bookstore, a indie bookstore in Phoenix, Arizona. And that's where I felt like I'd come home on many levels, and especially creatively. That's when I was able to remember how much I love to write, and I've been a lifelong writer and reader, and I've always wanted to be a published author. But my time at the bookstore was when sort of a dream became a concrete goal. I used to, when I was shelving books, I would take my thumb, which is actually fun to do now with this book. I would take my thumb and put it over the first name if I was shelving a book with the last name Newman, and I would pretend that it was my own book that I was shelving. I think being in the store surrounded by books, talking about books all day long, it just really drove home that this was a community that I loved and wanted to really be an active participant in. But I left the bookstore actually because I got a job as a flight attendant. My mom was a flight attendant. My sister was a flight attendant. I knew the benefits of the job, and I knew the schedule benefits would let me continue to work on creative things. So I left to go do that because writing, once I was able to sort of focus in on writing, it was a way for me to be creative that felt a lot safer than moving to New York and putting myself out there in that kind of way. It was hard to get all that rejection. And so because I was so burned, I really kind of turned introverted and didn't put myself out there, which is why when I started writing a lot more, it was my opportunity to be creative in a way that felt safer and in a way that I didn't have to put myself out there in front of my friends and family again and say, I'm writing a book, I'm doing this, and isn't this great? Which is why when I started writing this, nobody knew. Most people actually didn't know I was writing it at all the whole time. And so when the deal went public, I got a lot of text messages and calls from friends that were like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful, congratulations. You wrote a book? I'm very confused. So that was an interesting experience. But once I left the store and took my writing attempts with me to aviation, it was at work as a flight attendant that I had the idea for this book. I was working a flight actually when the idea came to me. It was a red eye from Los Angeles to New York, which is also the flight in the book. And I was standing at the front of the aircraft and I was looking out at the passengers who were all asleep. It's cold, it's dark, it's a red eye. And I have this thought that their lives, my life, my crewmates' lives, all of our lives are in the hands of the pilots. And it was the first time that I had the flip side of that sort of come to mind, which is this idea that with that much power and responsibility, how vulnerable does that make a commercial pilot? And it was a thought I couldn't shake. And so over the next couple of days, it kind of transformed from just a thought into a concrete scenario. And so I was working a different trip a few days later with a different set of pilots. And I just said to the captain that I was flying with one day, hey, what would you do if, your family was kidnapped and you were told that if you didn't crash the plane, they would be killed? What would you do? And the look on his face terrified me because I knew that he didn't have an answer. And I knew that that terrified him. And that was the moment that I knew I had a book to write. And so I got to work. When I was writing this book, I was working full-time as a flight attendant. So I would write on my days off, but I got most of my work done on the plane. Like I said, I flew red eyes. I'm a night owl by nature. And they're nice because once the passengers go to sleep, you're kind of left to your own devices. So I would sort of tuck everybody in and get everybody taken care of. And then I would get to work and I'd stand in my forward galley because I usually worked in first class. So I had the whole galley to myself up there. And I would write. And some days, were more open than others. And I'd be able to get in entire pages and scenes. And I'd also write on the back of like the passenger manifest or like a catering bill, because we weren't allowed to use portable electronic devices. So I couldn't exactly have, my iPad out and be typing for hours during the flight. So I'd write everything by hand. And sometimes it would be an active flight and I wouldn't have time to get much work done. I'd only have time to grab a cocktail napkin and jot down a real quick note and tuck it in my apron and make use of it later. So it was a long process of getting to that first draft. And then once I got to that first draft, I was like, I think it's a book. It's terrible. It's a terrible first draft. All first drafts are terrible. At least that's been my experience. But I was like, I think it's a story. I think it's a complete book. So I want to make this better. So then I got to the editing process, which was a journey. I wrote over 30 drafts of this book before all was said and done, and we had a finished product. I also, for being a very plot-centered, plot-driven book, I didn't plot it ahead of time at all. The scene in the cockpit, which happens fairly early, where Captain Hoffman learns of the predicament that he and his family are in, that is the first scene that I wrote. And I just went on from there because that was the only thing that I had. Like I said, when I saw that pilot's face, and once I realized there wasn't an answer to that question, I decided I need to figure this out myself. And I didn't know what the answer was. And that's why I wrote this book, because I needed to answer that question to myself. What would you do in this situation? And so I started writing there, and I just wrote the characters in and out of their problems. Yeah, it was like I said, a long winding road, because if you're writing a plot heavy book, in the editing process, I found out it usually would probably help if you had some kind of a roadmap when you start out, which I definitely didn't, but that's how the journey to this book went. So yeah, once I got my first draft down, and then once I said, you know what, I want to see if I could make this better, I edited it as much as I could. And once I had gotten it to the point that I thought, okay, I think I can nitpick this forever, but I think it's as far as I can take it. So I'm going to see if I can get an agent. I'm going to see if I can get representation and see if I can get this published. So that started the next chapter of this journey, which was another long, hard road of rejection, similar to my time in New York. I queried 41 different agents, all of whom said, no, thank you. And that was hard. That was very hard. I felt every single one of those rejections. And I wanted to quit and thought about quitting quite a few times, which was also, it would have been very easy because, like I said, nobody knew about this. So it would have been very easy to just stop, and nobody would have ever known that I'd stopped. But I kept telling myself that I didn't come this far just to come this far. And I knew that maybe the next one is the yes, maybe the next one. And I knew I'd always regret it if I didn't take this as far as I could and leave everything on the field. I knew I would always regret it. So I just kept going. And lo and behold, on my 42nd rejection, which was to my now current agent, Shane Salerno of the Story Factory, I got a yes. Well, I should say, just to sort of flesh out that story a little bit too, because that's a good story. I declined his calls twice, which, pro tip, if you're trying to get representation and no one is calling when somebody does actually call, I wouldn't recommend declining their call. It's not a great tactic. Worked out well here, and I don't know how, but the call came in and it was an unidentified number. And I assumed that it was, like a robocall, like a telemarketer. So I just didn't get it. And then several days later, my phone rings again, another robocall I don't recognize. So I decline it and don't get it. And that's when something in the back of my head goes, was that the same number that called the other day? I think it looks similar. So then I open up my voicemails, and my recent calls and my voicemails, same number. I've now got 2 missed voicemails that I haven't listened to. So I listened to the first one from like 4 days prior. Hi, I'm calling for Shane Salerno, the Story Factory. I start freaking out because this is, like I said, remember, no one is calling me. No one's writing emails back. So this is like my one and only shot. And I'm declining calls. So I'm now freaking out, and I'm immediately calling back. I get a voicemail, leave a voicemail. I'm sure my voice was shaking. Excuse me. Let me take a sip of water really fast. And so I'm trying to get a hold of him. I leave a message, and nobody calls back. So of course I'm freaking out again. Do I leave another message? Do I send an email? Like, what do I do? So then a few days later, when I still hadn't heard, I left another message that said, hey, I am, we haven't connected yet, but I'm going on a hiking trip in which I'll be without cell phone service for the next week. So if we can talk tonight, that would be great. If not, then I'll circle back, next week when I come out of the woods. So I hang up the phone. I pick up my friend from the airport. We drive to Northern Arizona, get ready to go on our hiking trip. And that night, we're leaving the restaurant to go back to the hotel before we go out into the woods the next morning. And my phone rings, and it's that unidentified number. And so I pull the car over onto the shoulder, I throw it in park. And mind you, my friend that I'm with, she doesn't know that I've written a book. She knows nothing. So we pull over. All she knows is that, like, excuse me, we're pulling over in the middle of the woods, for no reason whatsoever. And she's looking around. And so I put the car in park and I turn to her and I say, this is going to be really weird, but I promise I'll explain everything as soon as I'm done. Excuse me. So she's like, okay, sits there. I answer the phone and am trying to put on a good face, like, oh, yes, this is TJ, and trying to sound more confident than I am. And we have this conversation that goes exceptionally well. And he's interested and he wants to see the full manuscript and he loves the concept and he thinks it could really be something, but he wants to see the full manuscript. So I hang up the phone and it's just been this amazing conversation and it's silent in the car. And I turn to my friend Jamie and I go, I don't know for sure, but I think there's a really good chance my entire life just changed. And it had, because I sent him the manuscript that night, which was also an adventure in itself. I was going camping, so I didn't have a computer. I only had my phone with me. So I'm trying to do, attaching documents to, this email to send off to him, just hoping that it all works. And then I went into the woods for a week with no cell phone service, which of course meant the entire time I'm going, I wonder what he's thinking. I wonder if he likes it. I wonder, oh, this is going to be so disappointing if I come out of the woods and find him, an email that's just like, no thanks yet again. But luckily it wasn't a no thanks. It was a yes. It was my one and only yes. And it was the perfect fit. And now I'm here talking with all of you several days after publication day, and it has been the most incredible, surreal, amazing journey and moment to get to this point. I had my first book signing 2 days ago. What's today? On the 5th. I don't even know what day it is anymore. Everything is just a whirlwind. On the 5th, I had my first event at Changing Hands Bookstore, the bookstore that I worked at when I was shelving books like this. I had my first book signing there with all of my friends and family and even more crazy people that, I'd met on Twitter, or people who just read the books and read my book and wanted to come hear about it and do that. And I think somewhere in my mind, I thought, like, surely this must be just like my friends and family, that, and to just see the support from all of you and from people out there that are really enjoying this book and responding well to it has been just the most incredible experience. So thank you so much for that. And the responses to it have been wonderful and amazing. And I think maybe one of my favorite responses that I'm getting to it is people are responding to the way that I depicted flight attendants and the way that I depicted the role of the flight attendant. And that's been really gratifying. I wrote this book just to have fun and to take the reader on a really fun, exciting journey. That was my goal. That's what I wanted. So when I'm hearing now that the reaction from a lot of people is, I never knew that flight attendants did that much or trained that hard or had that much responsibility. And it's really increased my respect for flight attendants. When I hear that response, it is just huge, because I think that there's a common misconception that flight attendants are on board just for service. And that's just not true. If it was, I say this often, but it's accurate. if we were on board just to bring you a drink, they would have replaced us with vending machines a really long time ago. And if you have a heart attack at 35,000 feet, I'm not going to bring you a Diet Coke. I'm going to bring the defibrillator and I'm going to shock your heart. So it's been really, really nice to hear so many people say, this has changed the way I look at that job position. And I appreciate that. And all of the responses to this have just been amazing. And it's been wonderful to hear what you guys think and to have it go from something that was just a personal thing. Like that was the bargain that I made with myself when I started writing this, was that, you know, just write it for yourself. Don't tell anybody that you're doing this, and just write the story. And now to have gone from that completely private creative exercise to this has just been incredible. So I don't know how long have I been talking? About 32 minutes. Jess, I know I see down there some Q&As. So Jess, I don't know if we want to open it up and do a Q&A thing now.
Yeah, definitely. That's amazing. And before we get to the questions, one of the things that I noticed immediately while reading your book was that it was clear. I mean, like, we've never met until 32 minutes ago. But it was clear that, like, oh, this was a book that is yours, like, in the sense that it was clear that it was written as, like, as one of those books that it's like, this is mine, and if you don't like it, that's still okay, but this is still mine. And then, like, reading and being like, oh, like, I read the prologue and I was like, well, okay, we're just gonna be terrified of flights, it's fine. This is just how it is. I can't stop now, we're on this. But then it was just so fun, and getting to live in your world for a little bit, and then being very glad I'm not an airline attendant, because that would scare me senseless.
It was fun to kind of give people sort of a behind the scenes look at aviation, because I think aviation is one of those worlds that, like, if you're outside of it, it's looking in, it's weird. And I think it's often there are misconceptions about how it all works. It's just a very nuanced, very specific and weird industry. So it was, yeah, it's nice to be like an insider, sort of giving that inside view.
Yeah, like Victoria Schwab, when, like, after she had written her first book, The Narrative Witch, and it went out, and like, it still did good, like, it got out in the world, but then in a lot of interviews she said her second book Vicious, was written solely for her own gratification. Like, it was not for anyone else, it's just hers. And similarly with your book, you can just see the fun that was poured into it, and, like, the love for not only the airline industry but also just scaring people.
It wasn't my intention to do people. And I have to say, as a person who wrote the book on a plane, I know everybody says, like, don't read this if you're flying. Look, I'm just going to say, I think it is the perfect book for a flight, because it turns your flight into like a Disneyland ride, because it's like you're reading the book and you've got, like, the sound of the engines and the call lights. It's like a fully immersive experience. I think it's a great airplane read. I may be biased and partial and skewed.
Yeah. I mean, like, my problem is, like, I finished the book a little before publication date, but then I'd be on the bus and I'm just like, well, what if his family's kidnapped? What if he's gonna crash the bus to save his family?
It's been compared to speed, at 35,000 feet. So
yeah, like, the flight would be worse.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions. So let's see. One person asked, how did your acting training help you write?
You know, I think my acting training helped in every way. I think my acting training also helped me a lot as a flight attendant. I describe this a lot, that flying is actually a very theatrical experience. I mean, if you think about it, every flight has a beginning, middle, and an end. People are in costume. There are lines to be said. There is always going to be some sort of inciting conflict or drama. You have a set period of time in which you have to resolve this conflict and drama. It's a very theatrical experience in and of itself. And I think also being around people constantly, it's like doing character research incessantly. And I've said this before, that flight attending is kind of like getting paid to people watch. And I sat, like I said, I usually worked in first class. So my jump seat was in the forward of the plane and I faced aft. And we had a clear plexiglass bulkhead. So on takeoff and landing, and taxi in and taxi out, I can't be reading a book. I can't be on my phone. I have to just sit and look out at the people. So every day I got to just sit there and just do character research of what this quirky married couple in, row 2 is doing and what this young kid over here is doing. It was just, I think my acting background is the lens with which I view the whole world. And then you combine it with a environment like the plane, and I think this is the result. It's weird that I look back at my path now, which at the time didn't seem to make any sense, and seemed kind of random and also kind of frustrating, and not exactly what I wanted. And I look now and I go, weird. All the pieces like fell into place, and that made sense to get to this point.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Someone else asked, as an airline attendant, did you always have this book inside you, or were you waiting for the right time to write it, or did it come to you more recently or rather quickly?
The idea for it, when I had the idea for this book, that was like, it was like a lightning strike. And it was one of those moments where I was like, that's it. And now I just have to go. And I worked for a long time. Like I said, I was flying full time this whole time. So I would write when I could. And it was 2017 to 2019 that I said, okay, if I'm going to actually like give this a go and really try to make this a finished product and see if I can get it published, I need to do it. So 2017 and 2019 is through 2019 is when I really buckled down and got to work. And November of 2019 is when I got my agent. So that's when I kicked it into a whole nother gear to get it from finished manuscript to publishable manuscript.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so let's see. Someone else asked, what authors inspire you? And then I also want to ask, were there any books that you felt like looking back you needed to have read in order to write your book?
I was a child of the 90s, and so I was, the 90s thrillers, both in on film and in literature. Your Michael Crichtons, your John Grishams, your Jurassic Parks and Twisters. That is what I loved. Those are the stories that I grew up reading and watching over and over and over again. So I would say that those examples, were sort of the most foundational to the writer that I've become. And when I had the idea for this book, it was immediately so cinematic in my mind. Like I listen to music a lot of the time when I write, and I listen to movie soundtracks the whole time that I was writing this, like big blockbuster, big movie soundtracks to get me sort of in that mindset and that vibe of like, okay, this is larger than life. This is a blockbuster type of story. Um, so I would say that those were my biggest influences in writing this.
Nice. And someone asked, do you think you'll continue to write thrillers, or would you like to explore other genres as well?
I think that, I read and I write across many genres, but I feel like as I've gotten older, as you get older, you kind of realize that time is a finite resource. And so you can't read everything or write everything that you want to. And I think naturally, something that evolved naturally as a byproduct of growing up and having my time be more limited was I realized like I have to read just what I love. I have to watch just what I love. And I realized over time that it was like, okay, the stories I love are thrillers. These books and movies that from the first scene, from the first, sentence, grab you and don't let you go until the very end. That's what I love. And that's what I'm going to move towards. And so far, most of the stories that I have that kind of have that feeling of, ooh, I think that's something that I need to see to the end. They've been thrillers.
Well, I'm excited for more thrillers from you. Let's see. Lola asked, did you experience any scary incidents when you worked as a flight attendant that inspired the book or a particular scene?
Luckily, I've never experienced anything similar to what happens in this book. So,
That's good.
yeah, I've never experienced anything quite like that. But, as a flight attendant, you're constantly aware of the margin of error. And I think that that's something that I think that gets lost on a lot of passengers. This idea of, look, if something goes sideways, we don't have, there's only so much, like we are in a metal tube enclosed miles up in the air, traveling hundreds of miles an hour. And flight attendants and pilots are trained to be constantly thinking about, okay, something goes wrong. What am I doing? And that's why people ask me often, was it weird writing this on the plane since it's, such an extreme thing? And it wasn't. It really, really wasn't because, like I said, that's how we're trained to think. We are trained to think constantly about worst case scenarios and what we would do if we encounter it. That's just good safety protocol. It's just, preparation in case something does come up. So, that sort of mindset, that sort of like awareness, situational awareness of how small the margin of error is, I think it infused this whole story in that even though I haven't experienced anything like this, even something as small as, a small medical emergency, what seems like a small medical emergency, well, but is it? You know, Even situations that seem somewhat benign, they can turn like that. And now you've got a whole different kind of situation. So I think that, we're constantly looking at the world through that lens.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, let's see. Someone asked, while you were writing the first draft, did you have or any of the drafts, did you have a writer's group?
I had several trusted friends that I let see early drafts of this. The first people that I showed the very first draft to were my mom, my friend Sheena, and my friend Brian. They're thanked in the back of the books in the acknowledgement section. I let them see it first, and they give valuable feedback. I also had several trusted pilot friends that I let read early drafts of the manuscript too, because I had to make sure I was getting it right. There's only so much that I can see from the other side of the cockpit door. So I needed to make sure, this is what you would say, and that's how you would say it, and all of that. Yeah, so I had some counsel like that as it went along, and I also at one point in time, again with early drafts of the manuscript, like I said, I'm a former bookseller, and I mean, Jess, nobody knows books better than booksellers, period. So when I started writing this, it was like, well, why don't I go to the experts? So I went to several of my friends who were, former booksellers that I had sold with, and said, would you be willing to give it a look? So I gave them copies of the manuscript, and then they came over to my house for dinner after they'd read it. I cooked, we drank wine, and we talked about the book. And some of the feedback that they gave me was absolutely invaluable and really helped shape the book into what it became.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I'm still a book. Well, I feel like once you are a bookseller, you're just always a bookseller. You're just in that world forever.
Completely and totally. And I have to say, as a flight attendant, I was constantly hand selling on the plane because, I'm doing a beverage service, and I'd say, can I get you something to drink? And so as I'm making their drinks, I'm saying, oh, what are you reading? Then, we're in like a 5-minute long conversation about what they're reading and other writers that they like. And now I'm hand selling them on what their next pick should be. So you're completely right, Jess. Once a bookseller, always a bookseller.
Okay, let's see. So it looks like someone says the film rights for Falling has been sold, so congratulations. They want to know, how involved will you be in the process, and do you have any ideas of a dream cast?
You know, it's funny. People ask me about the cast of it, and it's funny because like I never dreamed in my wildest dreams that someone would buy the film rights for the story. Like I never dreamed that. So when I was writing it, I didn't like cast it with that in mind because that wasn't an option. So I cast all the characters, but with like fictitious people that are in my mind. So for me, trying to recast all the fictitious people that are just like, you know, just written in stone in my mind, to recast them into actual human beings is a weird leap for me to take. So no, I don't have a dream cast because of that, but it's been fun to hear what other people would say, you know, if it does get made into a film, that they say, oh, I can see so and so for that, and I'd be like, really interesting. And then I'm like looking back trying to figure out like, where did you get that impression that that character was like that? Because that's not at all what I meant, but I'm fascinated by this. So it's been sort of a fun thing to see what other people think.
That's fair. Yeah, that seems like a lot to try and take like your children and put them on actual people.
But yeah.
Let's see. So someone asked, now that you're a full-time writer, what does your writing process look like?
Right now, so the book deal that I got was a 2-book deal, which is incredible that I get to do this again. And my normal writing process that I'm trying to sort of work out now is mirrored to my flying schedule. I'm a night owl. So my favorite time to write is in the middle of the night. If I can stay up writing until 4 a.m. and then sleep until noon, that's my dream come true. I love being dark and cold and quiet and calm, like a red eye. That's my writing sweet spot.
Nice. Okay, let's see. So Shana says, congratulations, TJ. Your story is inspiring, and I can't wait to read Falling. We've heard about the 41 rejections and the 42nd try you got your yes. Just wondering about the time frame for your query process and what kept you going during that time. Were you getting straight rejections, or did you have a lot of interest in requests for pages?
Great question. All of the above. I don't know exactly. I wish I would have documented that a little bit more thoroughly, how long the full process was from first no to last yes. But it was long. But it was also a lot of silence and no response at all, which I think is the hardest, quite frankly, because the silence allows you to be hopeful. Um, you're just waiting for the next email to come in, or at least with, you know, if you get an email that says no, your hope can die humanely. um, there were a handful, a very very small handful of people that wanted to see more, who asked to see more pages. All of them said no. A couple of people wrote back actually great feedback, which is wonderful. Look, I know there's no resentment, no ill will towards those 41 who said no, and definitely not for not responding to me. I understand completely that slush piles are to the ceiling and that you don't have time to read or look at or respond to every submission. I totally get that. So that's what made it even more special and appreciated when an agent would say, I did see it, and these are my thoughts. So I got a couple that were like that and a couple that said, let me see some more, but ultimately all ended the same except for my one yes.
Nice. Let's see. Patricia asked, did any of the major plot points change a lot over the 30 drafts?
It was fascinating to see. I mean, 30 drafts is a lot, and there were a lot of changes. But when I was writing the final draft, what became the final draft, I actually pulled out the very first draft and some of my original research sources for the final draft. And it was really fascinating to see that the book changed, it evolved as it does, but the core of what it was and who the characters were and what the story was never changed. Never changed. It was always the same story. I just figured out ways to tell it better.
That makes sense. And like it from what you said about it sounds like when you had the idea, you was just like, this is it. I just have to figure out how to tell it. Um, let's see. Someone asked, what other creative aspects did you pursue, do you pursue, or do you want to pursue other than writing or acting?
Um, I can't draw, so I don't even ask me for a stick figure. That's not happening. I have terrible handwriting. I don't know. Right now, that kind of feels like enough and a lot. And those were my two biggest loves growing up was theater and the written word. Those were my two biggest loves. So it was, um, yeah, it's been fun to be able to dig in and have success in at least one of those areas. So I'm feeling very grateful and very lucky and very blessed to be having success now in something that I have pursued. So I'm just going to take gratitude in that and rest there.
That's fair. And I mean, like, it's a great book. But also whenever someone's like, what's your pandemic hobby? I'm like, I don't have one. I still can do these like three things semi okay. Whereas like in your case, like acting, writing, all great. Which is, I mean, I haven't seen you act, but I assume you're great. And okay, let's see. Um, okay, not a question, but we're getting a lot of comments in the chat and in the Q&A saying, I love the book. So Patricia also says that they were so excited to read it that they ordered it from a UK bookstore to get it a little early.
Oh, I love that. And that means then that you got the book with the beautiful end plates or the on the UK version, when you open up the inside cover, there's a plane. It's really beautiful. So that's exciting. You got that edition. Thank you for ordering like that. That's really cool. Thank you.
Um, let's see. And someone wants to know, is your next book also set in the airline industry?
I'm gonna play the second book just as close to the chest as I played the first book. For the same reason, quite frankly, it feels less scary. It feels, I can write a terrible scene and have a stupid character that will ultimately get cut. And if I'm the only one that knows that, then great. That's way less scary than telling people what it is and then finding out from someone else that that was a terrible idea. So I'm being pretty tight-lipped about book two.
That's fair. Um, I don't love it, but I understand it. I want to know, but I get it. Okay, let's see. Someone in also wants to know if you're a Suns or Bucks fan.
I mean, there's only one answer to that question, and it is I am a diehard Phoenix Suns fan. We've got like maybe 2 hours about until tip off of game two of the NBA Finals. It's going to be a decisive Suns win at home, and that is the final answer.
Nice. Um, my sister just moved to Arizona, and so she's getting into basketball now, or NBA. Is that basketball? I'm so sorry. I don't know sports.
That's okay. Just tell her we're welcome to the Phoenix Suns bandwagon. It's a lifelong fan. I'm a Phoenix native, and this is, the last time we were in the playoffs was 1993, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And it's cool to be back. And it's also wild for it to be the playoffs to be the same week of the publication of my book. So
Mhm.
I'm like freaking out about that. It's pretty cool.
And so, um, since we're a bookstore and you're a bookseller and I'm a bookseller, we have to ask, what are you currently reading, or is there anything you'd like to suggest?
Yes. Very frustratingly, I'm currently reading nothing because this has consumed every single ounce of my time and energy, which has been really frustrating that I'm not reading anything. And especially because, well, what I am currently reading, I just haven't been able to pick it up for a couple weeks, is Twisted by Steve Kavanaugh. He's a British crime writer, and it is, every time I walk past it, I see it sitting there, and it's like I said, it's been a couple weeks because things have been so crazy with publication, and every time I see it sitting on the chair, I walk past it, and I'm like, I wonder what, and I like remember where I left off in the book because it's just that captivating. So Steve Kavanaugh, he's brilliant. He's got a book coming out called The Devil's Advocate next month. It's great.
Oh, I'll have to check that out. Let's see. Um, okay. And so you had mentioned that on the flights you wrote, like since you couldn't have your computer, then you handwrote them. When the flight was done, did you go home and type them then, or did you just keep handwriting them?
Yep, I would go to the layover a lot of the time. When I get to the hotel, and then I would transfer everything over to my iPad, which means that in a lot of hotel trash cans over the years, there was a lot of like notes and napkins and manifests and things like that that got discarded with some of the original ideas for the book. So yeah, I would transfer it over like that, either on a layover or when I got home on my days off.
That's fair. And okay, so last question, that I personally need to know. If you were in the flight attendant's position, do you know what you would do?
I'd love to think that I would respond as cool, calm, collected, level-headed as Jo did. Jo's the lead flight attendant in the book, and she is. I know you're not supposed to pick favorites of your children, but she's my favorite character in the book, and she's just a powerhouse. She's a force of nature, and she is a consummate professional that just handles business. And
Hmm.
um, so I'd love to think that I would respond with as cool a head as she does, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm glad I never had to find out the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, even just thinking about it afterwards, I'm like, would I do what Joe did? I don't know. Could I do what Joe did? Probably not. um, wow. Mm, goodness. Okay, it's been so hard to talk to you and not ask like more in detail questions, without spoiling everything for everyone who's waiting on their comment on their
It's a
books.
hard thing to, yeah, to talk about this book. It's hard, and especially like if I have to give like an excerpt for something, like that's why I read from the prologue. And like I said, you can't go too deep into the book without hitting some major spoilers. So
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. There's like one question in particular that I want to ask, but I can't ask because it'll spoil everything. I'm like, oh, okay. You'll have to do like a on Goodreads how sometimes authors will go back and add notes and highlights to their book. You need to do that.
Perfect.
So then you can answer my question there. And that way people will have time to read it, and then we can form a little community. And well, not little because it's an indie next like bestseller everywhere, book, but then we can discuss it in greater detail. I'm forcing all my other coworkers to read it, and because I need them to talk with me about it. Um, so thank you for being our next all staff book. So
In the world to me, like I said, as a former indie bookseller, I usually, when I go into an indie bookstore, the first place I go is to the staff rec wall. to see what they're recommending, because like I said, booksellers know books. They know books better than anybody. And I always go to them to be like, what's good? What do I need to read? So the fact that Falling was chosen as the #1 indie book pick for July meant more than just about anything has.
Well, that's great. And it looks like that's all the time we have, unfortunately. So it was such a pleasure. And everyone in the chat and watching, well, I assume everyone watching, but everyone in the chat at least is wishing you all the best and congratulating you on all the success for this book and your upcoming book, which once that's out, we'll all just flock to and
There you go. We'll
read in a day.
And
Um,
thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting this and for having me. This has been really cool. This has been really neat. And to everyone that showed up, hi, thank you for supporting this book and coming out tonight. It was really wonderful.
Yeah, and just to echo that same sentiment, thank you for everyone watching and joining us tonight and being here in this community with us to talk about books and talk about TJ's book, Falling, which is completely amazing. If we haven't said that enough, buy this book, preferably buy it from us. But I get it if you get it through the UK bookstore because the end papers, I get it. I might have to get myself a copy of one of those too. But you can buy the book and support PMP and TJ by using the link in the chat to purchase Falling. You can read it on a plane. You cannot just read it. And then come into the store and we'll talk about it because I need to talk about this book even more than we have tonight. And like this could be 3 hours if I had my way, but then we'd spoil everything. So maybe we'll do a book club or something, because that'd be fun. But anyway, so thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, TJ, for your time tonight. Stay strong, stay